Okay, let's start off this journey into the skeletal system with the skull. This is page 87. Page 87 of the lab manual. The first thing we're going to start off with is the frontal bone. The forehead. It's the large bone in the front of the skull. So the frontal bone. Next one we're going to look at is the parietal bone. The parietal bone. Next we have the occipital bone. Occipital bone. Right there, what we're highlighting there, I've paused the video on the temporal bone. It means time. It's where most men start to gray first and show their time. The temporal bone. Next up, we have the mastoid process. It looks like a breast or nipple, or at least they thought it did. That's how it got its name, the mastoid process. Next, we're going to look at the mandibular fossa. Mandibular fossa. It's where the mandibular condyle meets up with the skull, the mandibular fossa. Right there, what's being pointed at is the styloid process. The styloid process. There's one on either side of the skull. Next, we're looking at the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone. It's a large bone that goes all the way across the skull. The sphenoid bone. There we go. We're going to stop here and look at the zygomatic bone. It looks like a yolk, they thought, so they named it zygomatic. It's Latin for yolk. And you have the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic arch. There's the arch. Next, let's look at the nasal bone. Pretty easy to remember. The nose bone, the nasal bone. Next, we have the maxilla. It makes up the upper jaw. The maxilla. Let's twist the skull around a little bit, and we'll look at the lacrimal bone for the tear ducts. Let's decrease the complexity. That's the lacrimal bone. Then let's look at the ethmoid bone. We can pull it out to take a look at it here if I adjust this. That is the ethmoid bone. Here it's called the labyrinth of the ethmoid bone. It's Greek for sieve. They thought it looked like a sieve. Next we're going to look at the mandible. The mandible, that's the lower jaw. This is the coronoid process of the mandible, coronoid, and then we have the condyle of the mandible, the condyle or knuckle or knob of the mandible. That's the condyle of the mandible. That's what meets up with the mandibular fossa. Then we're going to look at a suture next. Let's lock it back in so we can rotate the skull. Here we have the coronal suture going all the way across the top of the skull. The coronal suture. And then we have the lambdoid. It looks like lambda. The Greek letter lambda. Lambdoid suture. That's the upside down V. Then we have next the Squamous Suture. The Squamous Suture. Right there. It looks like a scale, they thought. Oh. There we go. Well, let's look back up here. Hang on. Right there. Let's get a good look at this. That is the external auditory meatus. External auditory meatus. We're going to go back to the mandible for the mental foramen. The mental foramen is that little hole. The mental foramen. And we're going to finish by looking at the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. That's the part you can see from this sagittal view right here, is the greater wing of the sphenoid bone.